My name is Taki Jaffrey. I'm a program manager, work on the Windows developer platform. We build the SDK that you guys are so fond of using. Thank you very much for attending today. So I'm here to talk about two things, just to make sure everybody's in the correct room. We will first and foremost talk about Facebook login. We'll cover what that really means, what you can actually do with the power of Facebook login in your applications. And then we'll talk about Facebook sharing, all the different ways you can share from your application to the Facebook graph. And this stuff is pretty cool because with Facebook login, as we'll cover during this talk, you can seamlessly engage with your users, get deep insights into the types of users who are using your application, how engaged they are, et cetera. And you get a lot of this stuff for free. And with the Facebook sharing stuff, especially the open graph, you can share strongly typed information to the Facebook graph and get tons of user engagement that way. And obviously, we all want our apps to go viral. When people share using the application, that's all really good. So jumping right in to Facebook login, I just wanted to make sure everybody's familiar with the concepts here. I like to start with this screen because this is a very common pattern that you'll see across experiences on the web today. This happens to be the Skype login. And you can create an account on the service. In this case, you can create an account on Skype, or you can choose to log in using Facebook. There's other social account providers as well, but obviously we're talking about Facebook today. And there's tons of benefits to this, and Facebook goes into a lot of detail on their documentation, but just this is the way I wrap my head around Facebook login, like why I should use Facebook login. First and foremost, this reduces user friction. Facebook shares some great case studies. You can go refer to them. But it makes sense that if the user doesn't need to maintain a different account, doesn't need to create a different account to sign into your site, they're more likely to go through it. And the second one is also interesting for us as developers in the room. Facebook has done all the hard work for us to implement all this security. We don't need to worry about threat modeling all of this. And my personal favorite is the deep user insights. I actually have a slide on this later. Because Facebook knows so much about the user, you can get excellent insights into the types of users you have, how engaged they are, et cetera, and you get all that for free if users are logging into your application using Facebook. And last but not least, it's all of us want our apps to go viral, like I said. Every time people share content from your application, we'll go into more detail later, all that drives clicks back to your experiences. That's all wonderful. This last point is also quite important. The user is always in control using Facebook login or any other OAuth login provider, which Facebook is an example of, because the user doesn't need to copy all their passwords all over the place, and they can simply use their Facebook account to log into your experience. They can always go back and deauthorize your application. They don't need to remember where all have I scattered my passwords around. So this is all really good for users as well. And these are some of the examples of the insights that I alluded to earlier. In this example, on the top left, you can see that's a graph of how many users you have on your site. If you want to sell your startup for $1 billion, that's probably a good number to know. I've blanked out the actual numbers. Just think of this as a relative chart. But Facebook measures in terms of daily active users, weekly active users, and monthly active users. And again, you get all of that for free if you use Facebook login. And on the top right, you see this really interesting graph. This is from one of my applications, where you see the kind of engagement the users are having with your application. In this case, how much they're sharing on your application as a function of time. And you see this interesting cyclical pattern. And as you might be able to guess, those peaks coincide with the weekend. So this particular application is of a type where people are more engaged with the application on the weekend. This could be useful information. At the bottom, you can find out demographic information about your users, what age bracket they tend to fall in, et cetera. All quite useful. This is all from the Facebook Insights portal on the developer site. I highly recommend you go check that out. And as far as sharing is concerned, I also wanted to cover a few high-level concepts before we dove into code. There's multiple ways to share on the Facebook graph. It's a very, very rich and expressive API set. But generally speaking, if you're sharing using a web experience, or if you're building a web experience, you can use their social plugins. And you can go to their developer site again. I highly recommend you check that out. We'll play with some of these at a high level later in this talk, in an Azure MVC site specifically. And then, of course, if you have Windows clients, which we all love and build, you can use the share contracts, which are built into the operating system to share to Facebook. Or you can, of course, always use the Graph API directly in a fully expressive platform. And one of the things we'll dive into a little bit in more detail in this talk is how you can actually use the Open Graph API and custom stories to tell kind of deeply rich and engaging stories on the Facebook graph. So more than just sharing dead links, how you can actually share structured data. And like I said, we'll go into this in much more detail. Now, to the right, the image you see is actually an example of a social plugin that's actually from the Windows Store, if you go to the web front end. And at the bottom, you see that like button. That's one example, one simple example of a social plugin. Click. OK. And because we'll dive into the Open Graph, kind of as I round out the introduction aspect of this talk, I just wanted to make sure everybody's familiar with what the Open Graph is, because we'll dive into that in a lot more detail. And I mean, first and foremost, it's an open protocol. You can go to OGPME and go check it out in all its gory detail. But the way to simply think about it is the Open Graph lets you express actions in your application with, if you remember your first grade grammar class, it's easy to understand. Actions are objects, actions, and stories. That's how Open Graph expresses behaviors. An object can be, I'll use an example later, an object could be a book, an action could be reading the book, and a story could be, John Doe read the book. So you might have seen examples of this in your own Facebook feed, and these are simple examples of expressive Open Graph stories. And Facebook provides some standard objects, which you can just use, the book being an example. There's a few others. And there's some standard actions as well, which you can just use without having to go through any approvals. But you can always create your own custom objects. They have tons of examples of that as well. I'll show you guys how to do that, although because it requires approval and a turnaround time, we won't actually be using custom objects in this talk, but I'll show you guys how to create that. And this is just a screenshot. I shared an Open Graph story. This is just, like I said, an example of an Open Graph story. OK. So I'm going to dive in. There's going to be time for questions later. I'm sure some questions are popping up. We'll even have a few prizes just to keep everybody interested. So if you think of any questions, please note them down. Towards the end, I'll try to leave 10 minutes to answer questions. And I have some swag to hand out if you ask a good question. OK. So I'm going to switch over now to write some code with you guys. OK. So I already checked with folks in the back if they could see my screen or not. But if during this talk at any point you guys can't see clearly what I'm doing, just raise your hand. I'll try to fix it. So the first thing we're going to do is implement Facebook login. And there's multiple different ways to do that. But one of the ways I'm going to show you is how to implement Facebook login in a Windows Phone application. So this is just a code sample, actually, that has been published already to the web. I'm going to start with a code sample just to keep things going easily. And in the notes to this talk, I'll link this code sample, of course. But the first thing you'll notice is we actually have two projects in this code sample. I wanted to give you a guided tour first before I started. This Contoso social application is the application that is trying to log into Facebook. And this login simulator is basically the pretend Facebook application. Why do we need the login simulator? Well, because we'll be using the Windows Phone emulator up here, the Windows Phone 8.1 emulator, and it doesn't actually have the real Facebook app installed. And the Facebook app is required to actually do login. So as part of this code sample, we provide you guys with this login simulator. OK, so if I just take this code sample and try to build it, I'll get a friendly build error because the login simulator doesn't actually do anything. It just echoes back an access token because it's not a real Facebook application. So let's go first learn how to get an access token. You guys will make friends with the developers.facebook.com website during this talk. The first tool I'd like to show you guys, if you just go to developersfacebook.com, sign in, and you use this handy drop-down, is the Graph Explorer. And the Graph Explorer allows us to do tons of things, play around with the Facebook Graph API. But one thing I like to use it for is just to get a quick access token. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to drop it into the simulator so that for the purpose of development, the simulator can return access tokens. And I'm just going to deploy this to my Windows Phone emulator over here. Here it is. And after that's done, I am just going to launch my Contoso Social application. And I'll show you guys how that works in a second once it starts. Oops, wrong emulator. Let's try that again. Sorry about that. Somehow it reset the emulator it was supposed to go to. All right, let's try one more time. Okay, so when I deploy the actual Contoso Social application, you see this handy login with Facebook button. All of this is in the sample code. I'm not going to go into terrible detail here. But just to show you guys the login simulator coming up, this is obviously going to be a very important part of your developer workflow. And you can just authorize it. And now this application has the access token, and it can connect to Facebook. And it can do anything against Facebook that the access token allows you to do. The login simulator obviously doesn't show you any of the authorization UX that you're used to seeing from Facebook across the web. So I actually also wanted to show you guys how this looks like on a device. I took the liberty of already deploying this to my device. And this actually uses the real Facebook app, just to give you guys a taste of how it's going to look like in practice. So same application. I'm going to tap on Login with Facebook. The Facebook application is going to launch. It's connecting to the service. This is probably a spotty connection right now. OK. And it's asking me if I want to allow this particular application that has been created on Facebook to connect. I'm going to agree to that. And it's going to ask me again if it would like me to post. It asks twice about read and write permissions separately. I'm going to agree to write as well. And boom, here you go. Now the application is connected. It's getting data from Facebook, my profile picture, my current status, et cetera. OK. So this was just a very quick summary of how you can log in to a client application, in this case, a Windows Phone client application, using the Facebook APIs. Obviously, there's lots of detail here, which we can cover in the Q&A session, or there's obviously tons of data on the Facebook developer site, how you can do this stuff. So moving back to my presentation, let's see. I wanted to round out the other ways you guys can do this. You guys just saw the first way of doing this, log in via the Facebook app. That's if you're developing a client application, or if you've done client app development on iOS or Android, that's something you're used to. That's supported on Windows Phone. You guys just saw a quick example of that. Obviously, there's other ways to do this, especially on Windows and now universal apps. There's the Web Authentication Broker, which you guys might already be familiar with. That's already a public API. There's lots been done and said about it. That's why I chose not to talk about that in a lot of detail today. But in Q&A session, if you guys have questions, we can talk about that. And then finally, the last one, if you're trying to log into a web experience, we'll go into a little bit of detail about that later today. You can actually, there's tons of ways to do that. The Parse SDK, which Facebook publishes. There's a bunch of third-party SDKs. But what I'm going to talk about today is the OWIN project, which kind of comes built into MVC. And we'll see how that works in a second. So tons of different ways to do this. Just pick whatever works best for your scenario. OK, we just went through this. So regarding the last topic, the logging into an MVC site using OWIN, there's lots of rich information that's published by the ASP.NET folks. There's actually a talk by them, which happens to be happening right now. So we kind of coordinated with each other just to make sure that because you guys are sitting here, not in that session, you're not missing out on a lot. But I still urge you guys to go check out Daniel Roth's talk. It'll be in the references to this talk, where he goes deep into MVC and Web API and how you can authorize against, for example, a website as well as an API exposed by the website using Facebook. But the concepts that you should be familiar with or the single page application template that we've just released for Azure MVC, and the authorized attributes that we support for Web API, which allow you to log in via bearer tokens. There'll be an example of that later. And he also has tons of content, like I linked up here, on how you can do other things beyond just logging into the website. For example, getting user profile information and adding Web API controllers to actually allow you to log into the site from client-side experiences. So the example would be that if you have a service in the cloud where, let's say let's use the same example here, let's just say reader application or any sort of photo sharing application, and you have a web experience as well as some client-side experiences, let's say an iOS app, an Android app, how you can sign in using all of those rich clients. Daniel gets into tons of detail about that, so I highly encourage you to go check that out. Just to, again, like I said, make sure you guys are not missing out on his talk. This is specifically how you log into a web API. I'm not going to try to pretend to be Daniel. You should go listen to his talk. Okay. So, but what I will go into lots of detail in my talk, kind of complementary to the Web API stuff that they're talking about, is this common pattern where I'm going to work with you guys to create a web interface to a reader application. I'm just calling it Contoso Reader, and then the user can register with that using the web front end, or you can log in with Facebook. Kind of the Skype example I showed you guys earlier. We'll build that in a second. And then just to make this an interesting example, the objects that we'll be playing with will be books that you can read, obviously, or you can share, or you can use Open Graph Stories to do rich sharing to Facebook for the books. I just talked through all of this. This is just a diagram of everything for the visually oriented people in the audience. Okay, so I wanted to stop here and actually pivot back to code. All right. So when you, I'm going to assume a certain amount of familiarity with ASP.NET MVC and Web API, but I'll go a little bit slowly just to make sure people who are not familiar can catch up. So when you basically do a file new project in Visual Studio, we allow you to choose these web projects, and you can do interesting things like choose if it's a single page application, if it's a MVC website only, a Web API controller, et cetera. That's basically what I did with some modifications, which I'll talk through. But essentially, when you do a file new project in MVC, this is the kind of single page application template you get by default. It allows you to register automatically. You can create an account on this service. It allows you to log in using an existing account. All of this is set up via OWIN. And it has this kind of helpful scaffolding or templating to allow you to use other services to log in this case, Facebook. So let's go build that, how you can actually log into this service using Facebook. And obviously, before we do any of that, we will need an application on Facebook. So most of you have probably done this before, but just for completeness, let's create an application. Right now, I'm going to call it Contoso Reader. I'm going to give it a unique namespace, and I'm going to give it a category. It's going to ask me to fill in a CAPTCHA. I always find these terribly difficult. All right, so now that it's created, it gives me two key pieces of information. It gives me the application ID and the app secret. And the template that Visual Studio creates for you stubs some of this stuff out. And in the startup auth file, and as you can see, you can support other login providers as well. But in the case of Facebook, you can just comment this out and provide the information that was just created. It's going to ask me to log in again to see my. Okay. And as soon as you do this, I'm going to hit F5 again. You see a bunch of interesting behaviors light up. Sit around, wait for my machine. Okay, so you're going to see Facebook login light up immediately. But it's not quite going to work, and we'll see why. Because the URL that we're running on right now is not actually set up to be trusted by Facebook. It's just a security feature that they want to know which URIs you're running on so that they know they're sending the access tokens back to a trusted location. And that's okay. I can steal this URL. It's better if it's HTTPS, but this should actually work just fine for now. And I can add this as a valid OAuth redirect URI right here. And this should now work. So it's giving me a warning about the UI. I'm going to ignore that for a second, but it's basically asking me to authorize this application that I just created. I click OK, and it's going to redirect back. And now I'm logged in. Daniel's going to cover basically how you can get additional information from Facebook to, for example, auto-populate these fields. I'm not going to get into that. But basically, this is just the ASP.NET sign-up flow where I can now add some information, like my hometown, for example, and create a profile on this site. So let's just do that real quick. And let's say Seattle. Let's register. And now we're signed in. So it's saying hello to me. I can log off. I can log in. And the other thing that ASP creates for me by default is this API endpoint. I'll cover this real quick. Basically, this is just a stubbed out sample API endpoint. But if I try to access this, it gives me some samples. And if I use the IEF12 tools, you'll see some interesting behaviors here, which I wanted to just simply point out. That if you say, okay, if you guys are familiar with Web API, a sample of the usage is let's say you do a get on API me. So let's just do a get on API me. Before we do that, let's basically run the network trace. All right, and immediately you get a 401 unauthorized because this is actually a protected endpoint. I just wanted to show you guys how that works. On this API controller, which was created by Visual Studio, this is the me controller, and just this simple authorized keyword is what's protecting it. And the reason it's not letting me access it via the F12 tools is that I'm not actually sending that access token as part of my request. So if you actually add that header to your request, that endpoint will start working. Okay, so moving along kind of at this rapid clip, because I wanted to get to some interesting Open Graph behaviors. Now that you've actually created this endpoint, let me run it again just to make sure it's running. Now that you've created this endpoint, you're able to this website, you're able to log into it. Let's log in again. It's not going to ask me to log in again. It's not going to ask me to create a profile again. Well, I guess because I started it again. The reason it's asking me to log in again, by the way, is because I stopped debugging it. It just recreated the database. It dropped the database and created it again. It's not expected behavior for it to do that. Sorry about that demo glitch. Okay, so once it's done, I wanted to show you guys a little bit of Open Graph behaviors as well. So by default, I've just populated, I modified the default template a little bit to add some books, kind of the running theme being that this is a reader application, and you're able to read books on it, kind of like a Kindle application or something. And this is just some sample data from Project Gutenberg. And the reason I chose Project Gutenberg, if you go there, is that they already populate their web pages with Open Graph metadata. So let's kind of step through what all that means. I just said a whole bunch of buzzwords. Let's step through what all that means. And I'm actually going to go to the Facebook Open Graph debugger, and let's take a particular web page on Project Gutenberg, and let's kind of discuss what Open Graph stories really mean. So if you look at this is just a web page. It could be any web page on your application. What they've done is they've actually added some metadata, allowing Facebook to recognize what's represented on this web page. So I'm going to just copy this URL and paste this into to the Open Graph debugger and kind of inspect what they've done on this page. And immediately you can see that Facebook is able to recognize, they're able to scrape some information off this web page. And that's obviously just information about, let's say, what the title of this book is, let's say what who the author is, what a short description is, et cetera. And these are the meta tags that the Gutenberg folks have put on their web page. We're going to do that on our sample app as well. But it's, again, using IEF 12 tools, you can actually inspect that information and you can see some, actually it's much easier to do this. Way to go. Anyway. Let's just do, here you go. So if you look up in their meta tags, they've actually populated some meta tags here defining what's represented on this page. And these are all these OG colon meta tags, so Open Graph title, Open Graph description. But the most interesting one here is that this, what's represented over here is the Open Graph type, just like in object-oriented programming, type book. So we'll try to copy some of these behaviors here and get Open Graph to recognize a page on our experience. So that's what we're going to try to do today. And the easiest way to do that is if you go into your application that we just created on Facebook, the Contoso Reader application, and let's actually play around with it a little bit, and let's go into Open Graph, and let's try to just create a story. So the way you can create a quick story is, let's do this. So you can do a bunch of different things over here. I'm not going to go into all the details, but I'm basically just going to say, okay, you can read a book, or let's just say borrow a book, which is a more interesting scenario. So this is an example of a custom action. This is not something that Facebook recognizes by default, the fact that you can borrow a book. And then, so you just tell them that, okay, the borrow action applies to a book, and just create that story. So you do that, and basically, they've created an example of a story that you can now publish onto your timeline. And they provide this really helpful code where you can do a few things. You can say, this is how you can actually post a story. This is the HTTP action you can take with the appropriate access token. Or I'm actually going to pivot over to the object types pane. And this is the standard book object. You can actually get some code and see how you actually can define this on your own experience. So recall again, these are the same meta tags that were represented on the Project Gutenberg page. So I'm just going to copy these for my own purposes and try to add them to the MVC site that we created ourselves. All right. Okay. So pause this. In MVC, the way you represent kind of the markup that is created by your application are these views. So if you recall, we had these different views for the book when we were playing around with it. You were able to create a book. You were able to delete a book. Those were the Project Gutenberg books I had listed. I'll just go to the details view for a book and just add a little bit of information over here. So there's a few things I can do over here. Let's do this, a shared layout. Okay. One second. So I'm just going to add the meta tags to every single page that is created in my site. That's just the simplest thing for the demo. And for now, I'm just using the sample that Facebook created, but you guys can obviously replace this with the actual URL for your object and so forth. The only thing that really matters for the purposes of this demo is your application ID, which Facebook was nice enough to populate in the sample, and the URL, which will populate over here real quick. Let's give a Project Gutenberg URL. right here. Okay. So just, real quick and dirty sample. You guys can navigate through more detailed samples later. And now if I go to the details page for a book, we can actually see the meta tags that I created. Right, these are just the Open Graph meta tags that were created, and you can inspect them. Obviously, if I now deploy this to Azure, I can actually use the Facebook Open Graph just similarly to how I use Project Gutenberg. I can use the Open Graph debugger tool to inspect that. Okay, so I also wanted to show you guys a little bit of how you actually use these stories in practice. So now I'm going to pivot back to a little bit to the Facebook developer portal, and right here you can actually see where they have an example of the story. You can get some code over here on how to actually create a story, which is publishing an action that we just defined, this particular story. A handy trick over here is that if you actually click the little sample that Facebook provides, they actually redirect you to the Graph API debugger tool, and you can actually get an access token and actually step through everything right here. So they're pointing to their sample site where they actually host some sample books themselves. I'm going to replace that with the Project Gutenberg, or in your case, you could actually replace that with a web page that's actually hosted on your own website. So if we do that, you guys can see that it's doing an HTTP post to a particular URI for this action. And if you actually do that, you'll see that this action was successfully posted, and an ID for the story was returned back by Facebook. And now, lo and behold, if I go to my Facebook page, you will actually see in my activity log that, I borrowed a book. I'm not sure how visible this is in the back, but let me zoom in a little bit. So here you go. Here's an example of an Open Graph story that I actually borrowed a book. Borrow was an action that we just defined together. And this is your application that you just created. And this is an example of something that people could click on to actually download your application, or this is how you could get some users. And of course, here's a link to the book that was actually shared, which points back to the original page. All right, so we're moving at a good clip over here. So back to my sample. Okay. So I just happened to use, obviously on Facebook, an example of a generic object type that already existed, for example, a book. But what if you wanted to do something more interesting, something that actually lived, and some concept that was unique to your application? So I'm just going to reuse an example that Facebook talks about in detail on their developer portal. And I'm going to add an object type, just a mountain. And the example that they use is if you're a mountaineer and you want to define an action of type climb, and then the object is of type mountain. And I can go ahead and create this object. I'm getting some errors on Facebook for some reason, but I'm going to avoid those. And if you go into your Open Graph object types again, you will see that the mountain type was created. And then actually you can go in and add a few custom properties to it as well. For example, a property of a mountain might actually be its height, or altitude, or altitude above sea level. And you can make that an optional property, or you can make it a required property. And then you can also do some very interesting other things, which you can read about in detail. For example, actions that users can take on it, and a subscribe action for like notifications. So I'm gonna save this custom property here for the mountain object, and then I'm going to define another action, which is climb, It's going to look a little weird that we're climbing mountains on a reader application, but just to show you guys an example of how this goes. So I create an example of a climb action. Again, I ignore the error, obviously. So okay, you have the climb action going on, and now I can actually create a story where people are climbing mountains, but this is not going to work because my object is not yet approved. Anytime you create a custom object on Facebook, they want to make sure their actions and stories are of high quality. So they go through this very simple approval process. It's actually very quick, but hopefully that gave you guys a little bit of an insight on how you can use those things. So back to my presentation to make sure I complete what I wanted to complete. There's just one more interesting thing I wanted to show you guys. We went through, just to summarize what I just showed you, because there was a lot of different things. We went through how you can create a self-hosted Open Graph object. So this is where I went into the MVC views and I copy-pasted in the header some metadata that I copied from Facebook. That essentially made my web pages just like the Project Gutenberg web pages, where they have some metadata in the header, and now Facebook understands them. Facebook can scrape them. So we saw how to do that, host our own Open Graph objects. We played around with some of the Facebook debug tools. Obviously, they're way more than I can cover in a quick hour. You guys can go play with them in more detail. Next, I'm going to show you guys how to embed like and share buttons. Obviously, that's a very important action. It's actually very, very easy. I'll show you guys how to do that. And then I showed you guys already how you can create custom Open Graph objects. That was the mountain and climb example. We didn't actually see that in action, but once approved, they basically behave just like the book and read actions that we actually did play with. Okay, so pivot back real quick to code. And let's add some like actions. So just like everything on the Facebook developer portal, they help you generate a lot of sample code to just drop into your views. What I'm looking at over here is, actually let me show you guys how I got here. If you go to developers.facebook.com and tap on sharing, there's different ways you can share depending on your platform. But I'm just going to tap on social plugins, and there are multiple different social plugins that you can play with. I'm going to show you guys the share button, one of my favorites. And here they basically allow you to generate some sample code of some that you can just drop into your views. So I'm just, again, going to cheat here and just for the purposes of the demo, steal a URL from Project Gutenberg. Well, okay. So this is basically the URL that you're liking or sharing. At runtime, obviously, you want to populate this with the actual object hosted on your page, but this will do for now. You can provide the pixel width, and you can provide basically a style. You can preview these styles down here. So basically, there's this share button. You can just do, let's say, an icon link. Let's do this. This looks good. And once you get code, you can basically just get, this is if you're using the JavaScript SDK. In our case, let's do a few quick things. Again, I'm going to go back to my handy-dandy views, where I pasted some things. And if you actually look here, they say I drop this JavaScript code ideally right after the opening body tag. So I can actually do that, or in the case of MVC, I can put it over here in the script section. I'm being a little messy here. You guys will excuse me, I'm sure. And this is the actual code for the share button. So this is the MVC kind of template page, which applies to all my pages. But what I can actually do is go into my details page for a particular book, and this is when you're looking at the details for a particular book, and then just drop in this div that Facebook created for me, where it's pointing to a particular hard-coded book right now, but obviously we could point it at whatever URI we wanted. And let's see how this works. Hopefully this should result in a nice little share button for us. Obviously. Oh, it's okay. What happened there, by the way, is I hit F5 while I was on a view, so it tried to launch the browser deep linked into that view, which is not a valid URL. So I just corrected the view real quick. And I seem to have made a typo over here. I just noticed that. So let me go fix it. Or hopefully that'll just be fine. Let's see. So if I go into a book now, I'm zoomed way in. Let me zoom out a little bit. So I can go into details for a particular book, and we have a share button. And this share button, like you saw in the markup, is pointing at the Project Gutenberg object. So, two people have apparently already shared that book. I can go ahead and share it as well, and I can say, hello, build demo. Hopefully this was useful for everyone. And I can obviously decide who I share this with, and go ahead and share the link. And now when I go to Facebook, to my page, you can actually see that this was just shared. Okay? So hopefully, I'll summarize again real quick. This is serving as a good introduction for you guys for all these different concepts. My examples are intentionally quite simple, but you guys can use these to build much more interesting and compelling examples, obviously. All right. So back to... Okay. So we've covered everything on this page right now, and we can refer back to this in the Q&A session. Looks like we'll have about 15 minutes to do that now. And I wanted to round things out by giving you guys a few more concepts. So this is actually an example of something we already saw. This is how you actually post an Open Graph story. When we were playing around with the Graph API Explorer tool, we actually did one of these posts. But you can actually do some more interesting things. For example, in this case, you can tag a place. So this is an example, which I didn't show you guys, of actually saying that maybe you were reading the book at a train station or at the Build conference, and then it will appear in a more interesting fashion. This being just one example of what you can tag. Obviously, you can tag people, places, a bunch of other things as well. And all of these make your Open Graph stories rich and compelling and interesting. All right. So I wanted to finish up by resources. Obviously, this was a fast blitzkrieg kind of presentation, moving through a lot of multiple concepts really quickly. But these resources are your friends. So the first thing I'd like to point you guys to is the Facebook SDK, which is published by the Outer Curve Foundation, very permissive source license. You can just use it, have fun with it. That also has tons of documentation and a very helpful quick start tutorial which allows you to get up and running with everything that I just talked about. And there's also NuGet package, which allows you to basically pull in some very helpful behaviors. For example, everything I did with login. For example, a lot of the things that I did with sharing, but also helpful controls like a friend picker, a place picker, building blocks that you need to build interesting experiences across web and client. So highly recommend you guys go out and play with the Facebook SDK.NET site. And then ASP.NET MVC, actually, and the ASP.NET Codeplex site, that's where you can find a lot of the code samples I talked about in terms of the MVC controllers, in terms of Web API. And again, another shout out at the bottom to Daniel Roth's talk, where he actually goes into a little bit more detail than I did into the guts of ASP.NET Web API and how you can authorize against Facebook specifically. And obviously, developers.facebook.com requires no introduction. That's kind of your toolbox of different behaviors that you can play with, including all the different debug tools that we did. And I'd like to finish up with another shout out to a different session. It's actually later in the day. You guys should go to this session. It's the contracts and pickers session. One of the things that didn't really go into a lot of detail on, everything that I showed was kind of web and some login pieces on the client. But one of the things you guys might be wondering is, what's the equivalent of the iOS share sheet, for example, or the iOS login sheet on Windows Phone? So my colleagues in the contracts and pickers talk are actually going to be delving into some of that stuff in more detail. There's some stuff to announce there. But some of you might already be familiar from Windows Phone 8, for example, or Windows 8.1, for example, that we have these share contracts built into the system, where any application can sign up to basically handle certain types of content, for example, links or photos or text. And Facebook on Windows 8.1 does that. And then your application can actually send data into the contract so that the user gets to decide. I can show you guys a quick demo of that if you're interested. So that's actually it. I left myself a good 15 minutes to handle questions, which was my goal. Hopefully we can now double-click a little bit. But I just wanted to summarize again, yet one more time. What's the call to action here? I mean, I covered a bunch of different things, but what are the few things you should take away from you? Well, first of all, use Facebook to log in. I mean, it's terribly exciting. It gives you tons of interesting behaviors. For example, the insights, that's my personal favorite, and it reduces friction for your clients. And then just start sharing. I mean, you can do easy things like just drop in share buttons, like buttons, to complex things like doing Facebook Open Graph stories, which you can format in custom ways, create your own objects, host your own objects using MVC, a bunch of different things. And then, yeah, hopefully your app goes viral. You make $1 billion or whatever valuations things are going for, and all the best to you. So last thing is, feedback. We love hearing your feedback. I covered a lot of different things. Hopefully it wasn't too high level. Hopefully it wasn't too low level. I tried to strike a good balance between the two. But I'm going to post these slides. Obviously, I'm going to post my code samples. You guys could take your time and actually step through everything I did yourself. And hopefully this will give you a good toolkit to build your own great experiences using Facebook. You can just take a picture of the QR code, and I'd love to hear your feedback. OK, so like I promised, I actually have some prizes. So you guys can get up and leave, or you can ask me some questions about Facebook, about Windows. Yes, please.
Your example showed how to post something while the user was inactive. Is it possible to post things when the user is offline? For example, if you're doing something out in the field,
Yeah, so the question is, my example showed how to post something to Facebook while the user is interactive, and using the like button or the share button. And the question is, can we actually do something silently on behalf of the user? Let's say the phone's in my pocket and I'm on a run or something and you're trying to post something. So the answer is yes. I don't want to speak too much for Facebook because this is more of a Facebook question, and last time I checked, my bad, said Microsoft. But yeah, you can actually do that. You need to be cognizant of two things. One is when you actually get your access token when you first sign into Facebook, right? When the user actually has to authorize your application. Well, that requires UX. That makes sense. So the user needs to log into your application and actually consent to granting your application access to do certain behaviors, for example, publish actions on its behalf, on the user's behalf. But once that aspect has been taken care of and you have an access token, yeah, beyond that, you can just make Graph API posts, and then you're posting actions. But just I wanted to make sure that that part is clear. You actually need to get consent from the user, and that is UX. So good. You can claim a prize later. That was a good question. Anything else? Please. So you said custom tags and landing pages. Can you, tabs. So you're talking about an app that's hosted on Facebook? Got it. Got it. Cool. Yeah. So the question is, I showed basically an application that's hosted on MVC, and it's kind of a separate URL, and how it can expose Open Graph tags and whatever, and I showed a bunch of things. But the question from the floor is, well, what about an app that's actually hosted on Facebook? So just like a tab in Facebook is the words you used. And yes, that's certainly possible. And I can refer you to, I didn't actually cover any of that, but I can refer you to docs actually offline. This is covered in lots of details on the Facebook site. It's also possible in MVC, and it's possible using MVC sites. So just kind of to summarize the answer for people watching the recording, yes, it's possible to host a site that runs inside Facebook effectively on MVC. I didn't cover that in my talk, but I can certainly point you to it. And that's more of an MVC question. we can discuss that. Good question, thank you. Please. Can you repeat the second half of your question? So as a page. Okay, so basically there's two questions here. One is he's asking when we post a story, can we tag things, like tag a location or tag a person? So that's the first question. Let me take that first. Yes, you can. And here's an example on screen right now. You can just navigate the Facebook developer docs for all the tags that you can provide. But what you're seeing here is an example of a location tag. So in the actual HTTP post, you can see that you're actually specifying a place, which is an open graph URI to a place on the example.com com URL. And then you're actually also tagging some people. Those are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, et cetera, are those people. And this is, unfortunately, an absurdly tiny screenshot. I apologize for that. But basically what you're seeing on the screenshot with the story is Matthew Johnson did something. Let me actually read this. So Matthew Johnson cooked a recipe on Cookbook with John Smith. So that's the example that you're seeing. So you can just say tags equals and then the FBIDs of people, and that'll actually end up tagging people in the story. And you can also do places like in this example. So the first half of your question is certainly possible. The second half of your question, I'm not sure I've fully grokked. Could you, the way I'll actually summarize what I thought I understood was, can a user post as a page that they're administrator of, not as themselves? Okay, good. So that's more of a question of how you logged in. That's more of a function of the access token. So the interesting thing over here is when you're posting a story, nowhere does it say, here's who I am, right? When you post a story, all you do is you describe the story that you're posting, and then you add an access token to it. And Facebook knows by inspecting that access token who that access token belongs to. So really the question is, can you get an access token of the page rather than the user? And yes, you can. And those are part of the Facebook login docs, where when you log in, you can actually log in as the page rather than as a user. As long as you do that and your access token is an access token for the page, absolutely the story will be published by the page, not the user. Please. Great. Okay, good. So the question is, I showed a bunch of web stuff, but how can if somebody has a client app, let's say a Unity mobile app, how can somebody do all these fun things in that case? So again, a two-tiered answer. One is, how do you log in to Facebook? And that was the first half of my demo on the phone, where I actually showed you all the, you press a button where it says log into Facebook, the Facebook app is invoked, you authorize in the app, and then you redirect back to the application. So you log in that way, and you get an access token. And once you have an access token, everything that I just showed, these are just web calls. So certainly in a Unity mobile app, you can make web calls using web client or whatever you prefer, web client being the preferred one. And a universal app, all these actions that I talked about are just simple web API calls, and you make them and everything will work out. Good question. You can claim a prize. Nick, do you have a question? Okay. Right. So the question is, the demo I showed was a Windows Phone demo, and the question from actually my friend from Facebook is how do you actually do all of that on Windows 8.1, right? So like I said in the beginning, actually, let me go back to that. The model for logging in on a Windows 8.1 app, and actually even a universal app which is running on Windows Phone, is the Web Authentication Broker. That's what we support for now. It actually does not launch the application. So if you were using, let's say, if you were on a tablet, for example, you would launch the Web Authentication Broker, and that launches as a kind of a modal dialog above your application. And all the behavior looks exactly the same as what I demoed on my phone. But yes, that is a web view, essentially. The good thing about that web view is that it supports single sign-on. So there's documentation online that you can access. And what that really means is if the user has signed into Facebook once, anywhere else on their device, and now they're signing into your application, all they need to do is just authorize your application. Just say, yep, it's OK to let this application access my account, and they don't need to log in with their username and password once again. So that's what we support on Universal Apps today. Obviously, always looking to improve, but that's what we have right now. OK, so I believe we have 3 more minutes. Any more questions? You don't get a prize. That was an easy question from a Facebook guy. Yes, please. Good. That's one question, yes?
Yes, and the other one is, if you're recording this web form, web API, that requires that just one way is allowed.
Good. So the first question was, when we create an object on the Open Graph, does that just become public? Let me address that question first. So there's basically 2 ways to create Open Graph objects. I didn't go into a lot of detail, but one is the model that I showed, which is it's basically a web page that you host on your web server, and it just has some meta tags, and that's the representation of the object. Those web pages have to be public because Facebook needs to scrape them, et cetera. So that's the similar example to, let's say, Project Gutenberg, where it's just a book object is public, and anybody can link to it, and Facebook scrapes it. Facebook knows how to represent it. However, there's a second way to create Open Graph objects, which I didn't talk about, which is via an API. So Facebook actually has an API to create objects. It's more of a Facebook question, so I didn't actually get into that. But certainly you can create objects which are private to your application. Let's say they only make sense in your application, then the user needs to be signed in, et cetera. So you can certainly do that. And Facebook exposes in basically an object API to create an object or delete the objects or manage them. So there's 2 different ways. I showed the easy one. Let's just call it that. Or also, actually, the one I like. And your second question was, I showed a whole bunch of ASP.NET MVC examples. I alluded to Web API multiple times, but you were asking, is Web API required to do all of this stuff or not? No, it's not required. Web API basically allows you your application to expose a RESTful endpoint, like a JSON endpoint or something. So the only reason I was alluding to Web API again and again is that a very common design pattern is that you have a web UX for your application. In this case, the book reader application or whatever. Hopefully yours is prettier than mine. And you also have an API that users can talk to your application with. And the reason you have the API is you might have some rich clients. Let's say you have a native iPhone application using Xamarin, of course, right? Because Visual Studio is awesome. Or you have an Android app, or of course you have a Windows Phone app, right? So all of those things, that's why I kept alluding to Web API, because that's how you would connect to all the code that you're writing using your rich clients. But certainly you could write a pure web experience, and we certainly support that across all our platforms. And that would also work very nicely across all your platforms. So it's just a design choice. The reason, and again, one more reason I kept talking about Web API was kind of login, because I kept talking about Facebook login. So to unify login across your web experience and your Web API using the authorize attribute that I showed, that's also a very common design pattern. Because let's say you have your iOS app, you want to be able to log into it using the same Facebook credentials, using the same Facebook access token that you already showed. Please. Last question. Yeah, so the question he asked was, I went and created an application on Facebook, got an application ID, an application secret, all that fun stuff. But was that really required if all I'm doing is publishing Open Graph actions, right? So, I mean, I guess yes and no. So basically, if all I did was created a website, Project Gutenberg website, and created a bunch of Open Graph meta tags to it, the first thing you'll notice is one of the meta tags is actually Facebook application ID. So in that aspect, yes, it's required, right? But if, let's say, all you're trying to do is you don't want to really mess with anything else, and all you want to do is expose a like button or something like that, then no, right? So the examples that I showed, absolutely, you would need to create the Facebook application, because part of the meta tags that are added is the application ID. So you need that. Yeah, even custom meta tags for sure, because if you created a custom object, of course, that is associated with an, sorry, the question was if you have custom meta tags, does that make a difference versus if you just have standard meta tags? And in both cases, one of the Facebook Open Graph meta tags, actually one of the first ones, is the application ID. So for that reason, Facebook needs to know which application this object is associated with. Okay, so guys, thank you very much. Everybody who asked questions, I have some swag for you. I really appreciate everybody's questions and feedback. Hopefully it was useful. Thank you very much.